Again, these are in place for safety purposes for everyone. So thank you for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Tous les participants, all our that required connection tests in advance of the meeting have been done. So today we will have two panels of 3 witnesses each. For our first panel, we have with us in person, representing National Council of Canadian Muslims, Stephen Brown, Chief Executive Officer. We have virtually representing the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Imran Ahmad, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. We have representing the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, Madame Samia Hassan, Executive Director. So I will now ask each of the 3 representatives to begin with a 5-minute each for their opening comments. Again, I will remind everybody, not just our witnesses, but the members, please be patient. We conduct our meetings here very peacefully and in order. And when I raise the 30-second marks, please take a look at that. And when your time is up, I will raise that. And if need be, if you're a member, I will cut you off. So don't let me do that. Please stop. If the witness has a few seconds left to answer, I'll be lenient. So thank you so much, everybody, for your cooperation. I noticed there's a number of members that are new to our committee, so welcome. And again, we are, I would say, we need to be voted the most respectful and most collegial committee on the Hill. So thank you so much, everyone. And I definitely do intend to keep that. Okay, so I will now begin with in person for Chief Executive Officer Stephen Brown, please.
Bonjour.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee. I begin by suggesting that we originally had stated on the record that we were not going to participate in the committee. That's because certain members of the committee who sat here have been complicit in furthering the problem of Islamophobia. For example, a Liberal member shared content from the past leader of the Jewish Defense League, a listed terrorist organization by the FBI, and a group linked to the Kahanists, which is a listed terrorist entity here in Canada. This member is well aware that he trafficked this content and has never apologized for doing so. Our hope is that the committee recommendations include, in part, the recognition that some committee members themselves have hurt, not helped, the struggle against Islamophobia. Because indeed, Islamophobia is a dangerous form of hate that has led to the murder of Canadian Muslims. More Muslims have been killed in targeted hate attacks in Canada than any other G7 country in the past 7 years because of Islamophobia. For example, the Quebec City Mosque attack that took the lives of 6 worshippers in January of 2017. And this month, we honor and remember the victims of the London terror attack, in which a terrorist motivated by hate for Muslims mowed down a family on a walk with his truck, murdering 4 beloved community members and leaving a young boy orphaned on June 6, 2021. In our sacred places of worship and in public spaces, Muslims in Canada are not safe from violent Islamophobia. This is to say nothing of the many recent attacks that have happened across Canada that could have easily resulted in fatalities. En dehors des incidents violents d'islamophobie qui terrorisent ce pays.
Except for violent Islamophobia incidents that have been terrorizing the country for some 10 years now, the Muslim community, particularly in Quebec, is facing flagrant systemic Islamophobia, which is enshrined in Quebec legislation. Let me be clear. Since 2019, the Quebec government has legislated discrimination. The impact of Bill 21 has caused a tremendous torment to innumerable Muslim women who have to choose between their faith and life in Quebec, a place that many consider home. As stated in the report of the Standing Committee on Human Rights studying the impacts of Bill 21, even though the direct repercussions of Bill 21 are concerning, the committee is disturbed to understand that it also indirectly strengthened marginal racist groups and individuals.
There has been a drastic rise in Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism across Canada. In Q4 of last year, the number of such hate incidents across Canada reported to us increased by 1,300%. Our communities are experiencing unprecedented levels of hate and violence from every level of society, including but not limited to professionals losing their employment or receiving disciplinary actions after calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, Muslim women with hijab attacked and harassed in public spaces, children intimidated at school by staff for standing in solidarity for Palestinian human rights, and peaceful protesters labeled as supporters of terrorism. Unfortunately, the response of the Muslim community in Canada for months has been receiving from our elected leaders has been duplicitous. One that says they care about our concerns, and the other that immediately turns around and further spreads misinformation and makes deliberate attempt to villainize an entire community as hateful and intolerant people. Simply stated, it's time to face the music. Islamophobia is real, it has killed, and will continue to kill if this study is not taken seriously. We believe this committee has the power and capability to adopt these recommendations before the end of the 2024 parliamentary session. I would like to put forward 3 key recommendations. First, that this committee calls loudly for their colleagues to stand boldly against Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, and reiterates the need to protect civil liberties in the House of Commons, including the ability to critique foreign governments. 2, that this committee adopt the Senate recommendations on Islamophobia, and 3, that this committee move swiftly to recommend that this government incorporates an action plan on Islamophobia specifically as an addendum to Canada's anti-racism action program that has timelines on the Senate recommendations on Islamophobia. Thank you, et merci beaucoup.
Merci. Merci. You were well ahead of your schedule. We will now next go to Executive Director Hassan, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Samia Hassan. I'm the Executive Director for an organization called the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. I'm joining you today, this morning, from the traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territories of the Mississauga, also known as C. Takaranto. Today is a particularly heavy day, as my colleague Stephen has mentioned. It is the 3-year anniversary of the London family terrorist attack. And I'm sure the heaviness of today will be felt throughout the day as others like me make their statements. I grew up in Toronto in some of the most diverse neighborhoods during the aftermath of 9/11. Being in school, in public schools, I had internalized the news that most Muslim communities are going to be portrayed as the bad guys. I spent my entire school life on the defensive, defending either my choice to wear a hijab, either defending my family's against stereotypes, defending my communities against attacks. What I didn't foresee at that time was that the hateful rhetoric would eventually turn into violence and fatalities. Our organization is a social justice organization that has been doing anti-hate work, anti-racism work for over 3 decades. We have been actively engaged in anti-Islamophobia work, particularly over the last 5 years, because we've seen the exponential increase in Islamophobia during this time. There are 3 main points that I want to highlight today based on the work that we have done as an organization. First is the importance of educating young people on anti-Islamophobia using an anti-oppression lens. Second is protecting our communities from online forms of Islamophobia. And third is incorporating anti-Palestinian racism as part of the strategy to combat Islamophobia. Over the last 5 years, we've worked with various different school boards in Ontario, particularly, to create anti-Islamophobia strategies for entire boards in partnership with the NCCM. We need all provinces in Canada to mandate such strategies for all school boards across the country. Teaching children to be empathetic is a lot more impactful than teaching adults to unlearn the hate and bias that they've been exposed to all their life. I understand that there are jurisdictional considerations over education. However, we know that when the federal government wants the provinces to do something, they have the mechanisms, the pressures, and the incentives to make it happen. We need the federal government to commit to this and encourage and work with all provincial governments to mandate the incorporation of identity-affirming anti-Islamophobia education for all publicly funded schools in Canada. Secondly, we know that the recently introduced online harms bill is a welcome legislation, especially for organizations that have been doing anti-hate work, online hate work for a very long time. We know that it's welcome in many Muslim communities as well. However, we want to ensure that there are rigorous oversight measures in place which will prevent racialized and Muslim communities from being unfairly criminalized. We know all too well from the post 9/11 experience what happens when Muslim, Black, and Brown bodies are over-policed. We want to be convinced that this online harms bill will not be abused to continue the oppression of our communities. Finally, the third point I know will come up quite often through the course of this hearing. Over the last 8 months, we have seen an exponential increase in Islamophobia and hate crimes towards Muslim communities across the country. We have particularly witnessed visibly Muslim women being exceptionally vulnerable to hateful rhetoric, whether it's online or whether it's in real life. We have also witnessed an interconnectedness of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in Canada and across the world. We have seen Muslim communities being targeted with Islamophobia because they support the Palestinian people and Palestinian human rights. We can't hide from this fact any longer, and this government needed to address this yesterday. There are no parts of our anti-racism strategy or anti-hate strategies that address anti-Palestinian racism. These strategies must name, define, and address anti-Palestinian racism in Canada. We must stop the further dehumanization of Palestinians by ignoring their pleas for protection from abuse, hate, and violence. Muslim communities and allies are outraged and broken by the very graphically broadcasted genocide happening in front of our eyes. Protests against this genocide have been widely cited as overwhelmingly peaceful, except for a few times where they've been instigated by police or counter-protests. To our huge disappointment, we've seen a majority of politicians either mischaracterize or wrongfully smear the legitimate advocacy for Palestinians or stay deafeningly silent. As recently as last week, we saw the shocking silence of our own Prime Minister when newcomers and immigrants were blamed without evidence for criminal activities. If we're going to combat Islamophobia in all its ugly forms, it's imperative for this government to walk the talk first. Our politicians have alienated Muslim communities at great length. And I'll end with my final concluding thought in regards to education. I think our politicians also need the same mandatory education as our young people on anti-Islamophobia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We will now go to Chief Executive Officer and Founder for Center for Countering Digital Hate, Mr. Ahmed, please. Yes, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, members of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. My name is Imran Ahmed. I'm the founder and chief executive of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, or CCDH. CCDH researches disinformation and hate speech on social media platforms. Our research has shown time and time again that social media platforms and search engines are irresponsible managers of our digital information ecosystem because their business models have systemic problems that affect the prevalence of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ+, and other forms of identity-based hate. No investigation of the current crisis of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia can be conducted without examination of these platforms' roles. And dealing with one form of hate, whether anti-Semitism or Islamophobia alone, fails to recognize the systems underpinning the common problem, that the rules of these platforms and the poor way in which they're enforced, their algorithms and their platform design decisions advantage hateful content. Now, my statement and the accompanying submission is drawn from CCDH's extensive research into Islamophobia and other forms of hate on social media platforms. It finds, one, that social media algorithms promote and spread identity-based hate, Islamophobia. Two, that financial. Three, that social media companies fail in hateful content.
Hold on a minute.
And that online hate has offline consequences.
Mr. Ahmed, can you hear me? Hold on a minute. We're experiencing, I stopped the time for a sec there.
Yep.
We're experiencing a bit of difficulties. Is there a recommendation from the digital folks in the room? Okay, just back up to number 1, start again. Let's see if I can hear that.
It finds, one, that social media algorithms promote and spread identity-based hate like Islamophobia. Two, that financial incentives fuel the production of hateful content. 3, that social media companies fail to act on hateful content when reported to them. And 4, that online hate has offline consequences. Is that okay, Chair?
It is. It is okay, yes.
Good. On 1, algorithms and recommender systems are the functions that rank and organize content on social media platforms, and they present it in users' feeds based on how likely each individual is to engage and interact with it. Now, that sounds innocent, but CCDH research has shown a strong relationship between these algorithms and the promotion of hateful content, because the design of these algorithms prioritizes attention and engagement, and incendiary content like identity-based hate is privileged in them, being broadcast to more people than content about tolerance. On 2, these recommend operate alongside the hate pace. CCDH show that social media accounts use the as a conflict to grow and profit, and will sensational and engaging hate content by turbocharging their follower growth, visibility, and revenues. Specifically, we found that accounts which began posting hateful anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in the aftermath of the attacks on October the 7th grew 4 times faster on average than before the attack. So this quantified how bad actors are able to exploit conflict to grow their followings, disseminate hateful messages, and potentially profit from this hate. On 3, the irony is, of course, that all platforms have rules about hateful content on their platforms. But again and again, CCDH has shown how their platforms fail to act on Islamophobia when reported to them. In our 2022 report, Failure to Protect, CCDH showed that Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube failed to act on 89% of posts containing anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobic content reported to them. Our researchers used platforms' own reporting tools to flag 530 posts which contain disturbing, bigoted, and dehumanizing content that target Muslim people through racist caricatures, conspiracies, and false claims. They'd been viewed 25 million times. There were hashtags such as hashtag death to Islam, hashtag Islam is cancer, and hashtag raghead. Content spread using the hashtags received at least 1.3 million impressions, and 89% of the time, even when told about it, they did nothing. And finally, on 4, online hate has offline consequences. Social media companies have failed to act on any of the matters identified by CCDH. And these systemic failures have now been recognized as a factor in hate-motivated attacks around the world, from Christchurch to Pittsburgh. These overt acts of hate in the offline world materialize social media's failings and highlight the significant stakes. Toxic communication is not simply an unavoidable occurrence in the digital town square, but rather a product of the social media business model, the financial incentives they create, with fundamental offline consequences. To conclude, CCDH supports the Standing Committee in undertaking this inquiry, and that any solution to the blight of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish hate in Canada must address social media platforms' role in amplifying and distributing identity-based hate.
Thank you very much. We will now begin with our first round of members asking questions for 6 minutes each, and we will commence with Member of Parliament, Mr. Moore.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us this morning for this study and for your testimony. And we also recognize that this is the 3rd anniversary of the tragic taking of 4 innocent lives, and that is not lost on us as well. And I do want to ask a question that's relative to that. I'll ask it to you, Mr. Brown. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada heard an appeal from the Court of Appeal of Quebec concerning consecutive periods of parole ineligibility for that were to be served by the man who entered the Great Mosque of Quebec in January 2017 and killed 6 innocent worshippers. That law was in place in Canada prior to a change in the law. There was a sentencing discount for mass murderers. In other words, if someone killed 1 person, they would receive 25 years parole ineligibility. If someone killed 3 people, as was the case of which the anniversary was this past week, the individual that shot 3 Mounties in Moncton, that again would receive 25 years parole ineligibility. When we were in government, we brought in a change to the law that valued each life so that there was consecutive periods of parole ineligibility. For example, the individual in Moncton received 3 consecutive periods of parole ineligibility, or 75 years. So that was challenged in the case of the mosque shooting. And we heard from victims' families on what that law meant to them after losing a loved one in such a horrific way. One member told our committee that she was able to take solace in the fact that her daughter would not have to attend parole hearings every 2 years to try to keep the individual behind bars. So it was May 27, 2022, the Supreme Court struck down consecutive periods of parole ineligibility and has returned the law to what it was prior, so that even in a case of mass murder, like what has taken place in London, like what has taken place in Moncton, like what took place in Quebec City, an individual can only receive 25 years of parole ineligibility. I want to get your thoughts on this. The federal government has not responded to the decision in any way, tried to frame any type of response, and obviously I feel that they should. But I want to get your thoughts on it, on valuing each of those lives.
Thank you very much, MP Moore. The Quebec City mosque shooting in 2017 was one of the most difficult times for our community in history. And the tragic thing about it was that this was not the first time that the mosque had been attacked. Leading up to the terrorist attack that happened in January, there were many, many attacks on Muslims in Quebec City, and specifically targeting the mosque. And the response from politicians and the media, quite frankly, was c'était honteux. It was shameful. For example, a dead pig carcass was placed in front of the mosque. And the radio shock jocks, one who is currently the leader, a leader of a party in Quebec, basically said, what's the problem? There's nothing illegal with putting a pig carcass in front of a mosque. The mosque was victims of hate. There were right-wing, far right-wing marches that were organized in the neighborhood around the mosque. All of these things were reported to the authorities. The authorities did nothing. And as a matter of fact, anti-Muslim rhetoric continued to rise in the province. And then somebody showed up to the mosque and gunned down 6 people. And everybody acted completely surprised. And I remember being around at that time and talking to members of the Muslim community and members of the Quebec Muslim community. And the sad thing was, people were not surprised. The mosque had already started looking at how they could improve the security of the mosque because it kept getting attacked. I remember going to the mosque and seeing a room full of children that were reciting traditions from our religion that talk about how tragedy happens to human beings, but only God, at the end of the day, truly knows the wisdom in those actions. I remember talking to people who still can't go pray at the mosque because every time the door is behind them. And it's impossible for them to focus on praying because they're terrified somebody's going to come in through the back door. Even to this day, when I show up at the mosque in Quebec City, people have to let me in. So to answer your question, the Muslim community was hoping that this, and still is looking forward to this person spending the rest of his years behind bars. That being said, the Supreme Court rendered a decision that, as you said, made him eligible for parole after 25 years. And we respect the decision of the court, but we will be there every 2 years to ensure that he, at his parole hearings, to make sure that he never leaves prison. And we are against the use of the notwithstanding clause to enforce back-to-back sentences.
Thank you. We will now go to Member of Parliament Zubiri, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et
Thank you, Madam Chair.
for being here in person and online today. Thank you for joining us. And we recognize your strength, courage, and advocacy, especially around this 3-year mark of the tragedy in London, Ontario, where the Afzal family was so hurt, and the London community was so hurt also, and lives were lost. I want to talk about the lessons that we have or haven't learned. We today are marking 3 years of the Afzal's family's passing, and the impacts that happened in London, Ontario, to the community there. We fast forward to today, and just last week here in Ottawa, which isn't necessarily a unique situation, but here last week in Ottawa, there was an assault that happened where a man was captured on video punching a woman in the face, knocking her to the ground, if I remember correctly. And this lady was pacifically protesting, from all appearances, pacifically protesting what's happening and her objection to what's happening within Gaza. Do you have any comments on that situation in terms of that assault and the aftermath of it?
Yes. So, just days ago, a man physically assaulted a woman, a Muslim wearing hijab, who was peacefully protesting right here in Ottawa outside the EY Center. He walked up to her and struck her to the ground. She was taken to hospital for treatment for her severe injuries. And quite frankly, it's incidents like these, among others, that are very concerning and are creating space for more blatant Islamophobia to occur. Another woman had her hijab torn off and was verbally accosted by another woman. Even at the beginning of this week, at an Advocacy Day event, one of our own board members at NCCM was accosted by a man close to Queen's Park because she's a woman that wears hijab. These sort of incidents are happening with alarming frequency in Canadian streets. And it just goes to show that right now that there's a real problem with Islamophobia. And for some reason, people feel that it's okay to accost Muslim women in the street wearing hijab. And that's why I go back to our recommendations. It's so important for members of this committee to stand up and clearly denounce Islamophobia. And it's really important to look at the recommendations made by the Senate committee, and it's important to adopt these so that we can move towards actually making sure that all members of our society, including Muslim women, can safely walk the streets in Canada.
Thank you. And you referred to a Senate committee report more than once. I'd like to know if you have, aside from us adopting all the recommendations, if there are any you want to highlight in particular. If not, I have other questions.
No, I think the entire committee, I think it would be good to look at all the recommendations. They should all be adopted.
And I recognize how that was a very in-depth and extended report that took, I think, the better part of a year by the Senate to conduct. I'd like to, our memories are oftentimes short, and I think back. I was of age. I became an adult in the early 2000s. I became an adult after 2001. J'étais en université
I was at university at De Miller.
My public engagement, my adulthood, till today. I look back at that period and I recognize how that impacted my trajectory, but I didn't realize it at the time. And part of the conversations that we were having in the decade immediately after 2001, I remember that you mentioned provincial, what's happening in some provinces in the country. And that is an important conversation. But I also remember at the federal level, when the last government, the Conservative government, the last time it was running an election, when there was gross malignment of Muslims, caricatures being put forth, you would see a niqab wearing person on the cover of a paper or be referred to every other day, or in some cases an election campaign on every almost stomp speech by the Conservative Party. Now, I recognize that people change and grow. I want you to comment, Mr. Brown, on the importance of elected officials being very mindful of how they talk about minorities. And I recognize how, since our government came in as of 2015, we were very careful to make sure that we didn't malign communities just to score political points. Please, Mr. Brown.
Yes. I remember being around at that time and watching how those comments negatively impacted society. I mean, my name is Stephen Brown, and I don't look like I'm from South Asia or Western Asia. So, I heard everything that people had to say about Muslims and Arabs at that time. But the fact of the matter is, it's not just then. There are issues now as well. I mean, for example, Marco Mendocino shared content from Mir Weinstein. So this is not a one-party issue. This is a multi-party issue. Everybody, all elected officials need to take this issue seriously. And I suggest that all members of this committee look carefully at our recommendations and adopt them.
Thank you. Monsieur Fortin, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Fortin, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd also like to thank all the witnesses who are here this morning, Mr. Brown, and virtually Mr. Ahmed and Ms. Hassan. This is an important subject, a very serious one, and I'm very proud to be a member of this committee who has decided to hear witnesses and report on Islamophobia. I believe, and my party, the Bloc Québécois, believes that all forms of hate are unacceptable, that living together peacefully and well means that we have to respect one another and not let political influence, race, color, sexual orientation affect how we respect one another. We must have respect for every person's individual way of being, so all forms of hate need to be rejected. That said, I've heard about the issue of online hate. As you know, we're already examining it. There is a bill underway on this very subject, and my party, the Bloc Québécois, has introduced a bill designed to remove religious exemptions in the criminal code. Exemptions which, the criminal code prohibits any form of anti-Semitism or hate, but provides for 2 exemptions. Well, several, but 2 among those are that if what you're saying is based on a religious text, you can say it. In my view, that exemption should not exist. I'd like to hear your view, Mr. Brown. Should the religious exemption be removed from the criminal code, or are those exemptions that we need to keep? Thank you for your question, Mr. Fortin. First and foremost, yes, all forms of hate are unacceptable, particularly hate that is encouraged by governments. That is even more unacceptable. Bill 21 is legislating hate. It targets minorities. It is taking away citizens' rights. I will answer your question, but I do believe it's important to say that there are several parties that are selective in the kind of hate they condone. As for the purpose of this hearing is to find measures to reduce Islamophobia. And this line of questioning implies that religious texts are the source of hate. So that is not only problematic, it illustrates why these audiences need to be held. Mr. Brown, you know we have limited time. Am I to understand that in your view, the religious exemption provided for in the criminal code is a good thing and should remain there? So fomenting hate on the basis of a religious text is all right, in your view? I never said fomenting hate was acceptable. As to the acceptability of your bill, I think it's up to the courts to determine if it's acceptable. Well, yes, and there are courts looking at it. I want your opinion on my question, and you're not obliged to give it. But I'll come back to Bill 21. We are in the federal parliament now, and Quebec's legislation is not our concern, but I would like to talk to you about the principle. If I read Bill 21, it's fairly simple. It says that each person is free to practice the religion of their choice and to wear any religious signs, be it from the Jewish community, Muslim community, Catholic community, or any community, but that the state has to remain secular and neutral. And that means that people who represent the state, so police officers, judges, and teachers, should not be showing any religious preferences or signs so that the citizens who are dealing with them feel comfortable in displaying their religious preference with no fear of being discriminated against. So could you explain to me how, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how does this bill represent hate by the state? How much time do I have, Madam Chair? You have time. I have a minute left and I'm listening. It is important to state that the so-called secularism bill, which should be called the hijab interdiction bill, and I will cite the Premier of Quebec, has nothing to do with secularism. The reality, as François Legault said in an interview with Sylvain Roy, after Bill 21 was passed, he said that the reason Bill 21 was needed was that sometimes you have to give something to the majority. What does it mean, and what was he giving to the majority, this Premier of Quebec? He wasn't giving them chocolate bars. He was giving them our rights, and he was doing it because they're racists in society. So according to the Premier of Quebec, in an interview with Radio-Canada, he passed Bill 21 to appease racist sentiments. In the same bill, there's a provision saying that, yes, the state needs to be neutral, but crosses in offices, crosses in hospitals, that's fine, but the people have to be neutral. So what exactly is a neutral human being, Mr. Fortin? Thank you, Mr. Brown. My time is up, but I do appreciate your testimony.
To Mr. Garrison, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today, in particular on this day, which is a difficult day for the Muslim community around the country, and in particular in London, and acknowledge once again that we were privileged in our first session to hear from family and friends from London to talk about the real impacts in everyday life of Islamophobia. I want to thank Mr. Brown for drawing our attention to the Senate recommendations. And I want to also thank Ms. Hassan for drawing our attention to silence as well as words. I think it's a very important point that she made, that silence often speaks volumes. And so I do want to turn my questions to Mr. Ahmed. And I think it's clear to all of us that identity-based hate is not new, but the phenomena and the way it's treated on social media is something new. And so in your research, I guess I have two questions. One, have you found that social media has assumed the primary role in promoting hate? And the second question is, who is the hate most likely to be promoted to in online media?
Mr. Ahmed, you are
So
having difficulties. We will bear with you, and there, because I've been informed there's nothing we can do in the room. So, but go ahead. Hopefully, you're not frozen.
Sure.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
Social media, for better or for worse, social media has become the primary means by which we share information, by which we negotiate our values, by which we negotiate even the corpus of information that we call facts. And it has become the main means by which we set our norms of attitude and behavior. And as such, it has a re-socializing effect on the offline world that with the heightened prevalence of hate and the lies that always underpin hate, lies and hate are inextricably interlinked. What we see is a growing normalization of hateful ideas and hate speech itself. I think to address the second part of your question, I think the real issue that we have with the growing prevalence of hate is that it is fed to the people. It's fed both to the people who are victims because they engage with it, and it therefore makes the world seem more hateful. It leads to polarization as a result. And it's also fed to the people that have shown some interest in it before. But the truth is that it's also fed just to normal members of the public and therefore has that re-socializing effect as well. And all three elements, whether it is terrorizing Muslims, it is encouraging people who hate Muslims, or it is making the general public feel that, you know what, most people hate Muslims. It has different, but nevertheless highly pernicious effects.
Well, I think one of the things we're all focused on this committee is finding things, practical things we can do. And the online media giants have proven remarkably immune to attempts to get better behavior from them. So when you talk about financial incentives, do you see any practical things governments could do to reduce the ability of online media to profit from online hate?
Pass comprehensive transparency legislation that opens up the algorithms, opens up their content enforcement policies and how they take decisions, that if content is taken down or left up, you know what rule they've applied and how they've assessed it. And finally, create transparency on the advertising. That is the main reason that social media exists. We are the cattle. Users are the cattle on social media. We're the eyeballs for the real customers, which are the advertisers. And we need to have more transparency on how the demands of advertisers affect the way that they present information to us. Second of all, you need to hold them accountable more effectively, but you can only do that once you have transparency. And then finally, you need to have means for individual and societal recourse, the ways to impose costs on these companies if they fail, if in their negligence they cause harm to be dealt to a member of the public. So if you are the victim of an attack by someone who was radicalized by being bombarded with hate content online, you should have some way of holding them accountable. But also at a systemic level as well, Canada should have the ability to say, clean up your act or we'll impose costs on you for your failure to act. Because what we have a crisis of with social media is we have a crisis of inaction by those companies. They feel no pressure, and it's time to ratchet up the pressure. The European Union's passed a Digital Services Act. The United Kingdom has passed an Online Safety Act. Both of them have transparency, accountability, and economic responsibility for their negative externalities deeply embedded within the logic of how they operate.
Have you seen in your research any examples of advertisers taking any responsibility for the connection of their ads to the promotion of hate?
I mean, we did a study last year when Elon Musk took over X that went on the front page of the New York Times and led to him losing $100 million, he claims, of advertising. I know this because he then sued us at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Mr. Musk and the X Corporation, for having done the research, having had the temerity to do the research. And that's another good reason why we need to have transparency to protect those people who are trying to find out what is going on those platforms.
Thank you very much. We will now go to our second round with 5 minutes to MP Vempopta, please.
Good. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here with us today to help us navigate through this very difficult and challenging study to combating Islamophobia. And we're particularly sensitive to the topic today, being the third anniversary of the tragic London shootings. So, Mr. Ahmad, I've been fascinated by your testimony today, and also what I read about you on your organization's website. You were highly critical of social media giants for not delivering on their promise to uphold the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorism and violent extremist content online. And you say, as you repeated today as well, that according to your research today, the social media platforms failed 89% of the time. So they got it right 11% of the time. Not a good ratio. So my question to you is whether the technology exists for social media platforms to drastically improve this ratio. Now, in preparing for this committee, I did a little of my own research, and your website pointed me to the term great replacement theory, which I didn't know very much about. So I thought I would Google it. You know, these are all just ordinary English words, great replacement in theory. And what popped up was, on my screen anyways, was 5 or 6 academic papers, encyclopedic papers explaining what this theory is and being highly critical of it as being racist. So my question to you is, does the technology exist to distinguish between good uses of the term and bad uses of that term, so that people like me who are just wanting to do honest and open research aren't cut off?
So we're talking about social media platforms specifically, and what we're also talking about is when users report hate to them, and that hate is banned under their rules, what action do they take? And what we found was that when you report to them, you hold out your hand asking for help. You hold out your hand asking for justice under the rules that are our responsibilities as user, and I'm sure you're a responsible man, and therefore you abide by all the rules these platforms and don't post hate content. But rules that these responsibilities that we feel are a reciprocal right that we expect others to abide by them too, and for the platform that owns them to enforce those rules. And we find that 89% of the time, even when reported to them, they take no action. This is not about technology. This is about the will to act. If they want to get that up to 100%, invest in trust and safety. Invest in content moderation. Invest in rule enforcement. Or tell us the truth. You don't care. But either way, we're either being gaslit or they are chronically underspending on rules that they claim they want to enforce.
Good, thank you. So what role does education play? You've been quoted as saying that you want to make sure that people are fully informed and that we help them to produce material that inoculates them against grand themes that underpin new Islamic conspiracies. Could you explain what that is? What role does education play for individuals?
I mean, there is some evidence that inoculation and education can have a limited, both in terms of how effective it is and how long it lasts, effect on reducing the transmissibility of hate. So it gives people protection when they, sort of a pre-existing set of understandings that help give them resilience against hate content and the lies that underpin hate. But that doesn't change the fact that they're being bombarded. We have something in our psychology called the illusory truth effect. If we see something frequently, we think it's more likely to be true. And that's part of the reason that when we are being bombarded with hate content, we end up concluding there can be no smoke without fire. And we start to normalize hateful attitudes and conspiracy theories and lies. The Great Replacement Theory specifically is the theory that Jews are encouraging migration of Muslims and blacks destroy the white race through intermarriage and interbreeding.
Thank you very much, Mr.
It's
Ahmed.
taken the lives of Jews, Muslims, and others.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will now go with MP Zahid for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to all the witnesses. I would like to note that today is the 3rd anniversary of the act of the Islamophobic terrorism in London that took the lives of the Afzal family and shook the Muslim community across Canada. Our London family are in our prayers today and all days. I would like to ask Mr. Brown to comment on how acts of Islamophobia like this impact the sense of safety and security that members of the community feel in Canada, and if there is any specific example of the increase of the Islamophobic incidents in the past few months.
Thank you very much, MP Zahid. Yeah, over the past, as I said before, over the past 8 months, there's been an enormous rise in Islamophobia across the country. We've seen a 1,300% increase in cases reported to our legal clinic at the National Council of Canadian Muslims. And one of the most egregious examples that came across our desk was that of a young boy who, his name is Hamza. And he's a Muslim student in a special needs program at York Region District School Board High School. Hamza was violently attacked by a group of students who were calling him Hamas instead of Hamza, among other racist and Islamophobic slurs. That vicious attack left Hamza bloodied with a fractured nose. He was having difficulty breathing, among other health issues, but the school failed to call for an ambulance or respond to Hamza's medical and other needs. And it was after immense frustration with the school's response that Hamza's parents were forced to move him to another school, and this is while the bullies themselves remained in the school. This is just one of many examples of the most vulnerable members of our community paying the price for Islamophobia in our society.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. As a woman who wears a hijab, Bill 21 in Quebec is of great concern. So could you please explain to us how Bill 21 creates systemic discrimination?
Yes, absolutely. Bill 21 is a law that was passed with the explicit objective to take away the rights of minorities. Leading up to Bill 21, there was long discussions in society about the basically discomfort that many people faced with Muslim women in particular. And many governments prior to the CAQ government had made recommendations to remove people's rights, but it was in 2019 that the Quebec government moved to enact a law that would take away the rights of citizens to practice certain professions. This is, for me, as a Quebecer and as a Black Canadian, extremely disturbing. I come from a family, my family's been here for 7 generations. When my father was born in 1949, Black people still didn't have the right to go to university and study what they want to or work where they want to. My grandfather couldn't work at the steel factory in Hamilton because the unions didn't want Blacks. I am the first male born in the history of my family with the right to work and study where I want to. And I am the last generation of my family to be able to do so because the Quebec government, once again, passed a law that means that people that look like me and my family are now barred from certain professions because of what we look like. The government of Quebec has returned my family to the 1940s. This is happening in Canada. Passed using the notwithstanding clause, sous bâillon, so that there was no debate at the National Assembly. And this was done because the Prime Minister of Quebec said in an interview after he passed this law that sometimes you gotta give a little bit to the majority because they're racist people in society that are anxious about the way that my religious minorities look like in the streets. This is something that our country cannot tolerate. Canada cannot be a liberal democracy and have one set of rules for one type of people and another set of rules for another people based on their identity. There is a term used to describe people, citizens that have less rights than others based on their identity. This technical term are called second-class citizens. And that is what Bill 21 has created in our country. And it is this government's responsibility to ensure that a Canadian passport for my family means the same as a Canadian passport for any other Canadian family.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 2.5 minutes now each to MP Fortin and MP Garrison.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brown, if I may, I'll begin with you. Our opinions on Bill 21 diverge. I don't want to enter that debate because we only have 2 minutes. We've heard in the past few weeks testimony from the Jewish community saying that there was discrimination against Jews in Canada, hate movements and so on. And now we're hearing people from the Muslim community saying much the same thing substantively. In both cases, I think that is deplorable and shouldn't be happening. We are seeking solutions. I understand from your testimony that the secularism of the state is not the solution. Bill 21 is not the solution. You haven't told me whether you believe that the religious exemption in the criminal code should be removed. I'd like to hear you on solutions. I understand we need to recognize Islamophobia. In my view, we've already done that. But going beyond that, is there a solution that to you seems both reasonable and effective against all forms of discrimination in Quebec and Canada, against the Muslim community, against the Jewish community, or against any community? Yes. First and foremost, I never said that secularism or the separation of religion and the state was inherent to our society. In any liberal democracy, that is fundamental. It's fundamental to have a separation between religion and the state to ensure that everyone can have different opinions. It's a foundation for that. But that's why we need open secularism, to make sure that secularism doesn't, in and of itself, become an anti-religious tool. I'm sorry, we only have a few seconds left. Yes, indeed, but it comes back to our recommendations. Education. My father and grandfather experienced far fiercer discrimination than I have. We need to respect the laws of the country to make sure that nobody is a victim of hate, and those who say hateful things should be responsible.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to return to Mr. Ahmed. There's a feeling that's often expressed that the internet is a marketplace of ideas and those kind of things. So I wonder, in your research of your organization, which is, I know is quite extensive, whether you found there are certain groups which are exploiting the weakness of the companies in responding to online hate. So are there organized groups out there using the weakness of the response to promote hate?
I mean, in short, yes. There are people who do it for ideological reasons because they want to encourage hate. And now there is a growing cadre of people who do it just for profit, because hate is, you see, this has never been about freedom of speech. This has been about social media platforms choosing certain kinds of speech to promote and other kinds of speech to not make as visible. And we know that they promote hate speech. So you've actually got a cadre of people who realize they can make money out of this, out of spreading hateful content, because it drives not just positive, but negative reactions too. And that's crucial, is that quite often the people saying, how dare you, are actually bringing in dollars to the people who are saying the hate in the first instance. And I think that a combination of both of those, this isn't really about a marketplace of ideas. This is about the choices made about who to promote and who not to, and about monetization of hatred. Because, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's younger than I am. He's worth $100 billion. He's not in the free speech game. He's in the paid speech game, in the advertising game.
And can you make some comment on the use of the internet by white supremacist organizations to promote hatred, both against Muslims and Jews?
Yeah, look, white supremacists absolutely, crucially understand that this is an opportunity for them to spread hatred against Muslims and Jews and play them off against each other. And I think that's what's been so dispiriting about the last 9 months since October the 7th, is seeing the way that platforms, algorithms, and sometimes groups themselves have played the tune of white supremacists who hate all of us, frankly.
Thank you very much. And as the chair, I want to thank you for appearing in witness and virtually, or in person and virtually this morning. And again, condolences for the families that have their memorial today for the loss they've suffered. So thank you very much. Please give me a minute until we ensure that the 3 witnesses that are coming to us for the second panel, they're appearing virtually, are all online. So thank you very much. So we will start virtually. Welcome to Dr. Anwar M. Eamon, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Islamic Legal History and Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies, University of Toronto. Dr. Jasmine Zain, Professor Sociology and Muslim Studies, Option, Wilfrid Laurier University. I believe we have a third witness who is having difficulties connecting because of the headset, but I will acknowledge her presence, and she may not be able to speak at this moment. If we are able to arrange it for Monday, we will. If not, apologies. But Dr. Julie McFarlane, Emerita Distinguished Professor of Law. So let me start with the first 5 minutes, please, avec Dr. Eamon, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, and I wish to thank the Standing Committee for inviting me today. The clerk has my written submission, to which I added additional materials that I refer to herein. My oral remarks will briefly summarize what I have written, and I welcome the discussion thereafter. I offer 2 substantive points for this committee's consideration. The first concerns what I consider a category error in this committee's terms of reference. The second is meant to focus on how structural Islamophobia persists in our public and private institutions and should be a point of concern for this committee. So first, I am mindful that this committee's mandate is influenced by the war in Israel and Palestine, and specifically in Gaza. With that in mind, I believe the committee's terms of reference suffer from a fundamental category error. It erases the hatred of Palestine and Palestinians and instead collapses it into the category of Islamophobia. As a historian, I can assure you that Palestinians and Palestine cannot be simplistically reduced to the category of Muslim or Islam. Nonetheless, as my colleagues and I explain in a primer included with my written submission, Canadians across various professions and educational levels make this category error. I believe this category error creates more room for hate, bias, and stereotype to proliferate unchecked. The category error mistakes Islamophobia for what the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association calls anti-Palestinian racism, or APR. I fear that this committee's dual focus on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism perpetuates this erasure and exclusion. If the committee's work perpetuates the category error of mistaking APR for Islamophobia, you run the risk of developing misguided policies for 3 reasons. 1, you will overestimate the scope and scale of Islamophobia in Canada and thereby create false positives. 2, you will underestimate and thereby fail to address anti-Palestinian racism in Canada. 3, you will reduce a geopolitical, historical, and colonial conflict to a simplistic religious one. This reduction, ironically, will implicate this body in perpetuating retrograde stereotypes of the religious backwardness and unmodernity of Jews and Muslims. Hence, I recommend this committee to advise the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat to undertake sustained analysis of anti-Palestinian racism, acknowledge its pervasiveness, and develop and promote resources to combat it. 2. My second focus is on structural Islamophobia in Canada's public and private institutions. One limitation in debates on Islamophobia is a limited analysis of how our public and private institutions enable Islamophobia as respectable policy and bureaucratic practice. I have 4 examples to illuminate how this takes shape in federal government practices. 1. Some of you may know my 2021 co-authored study of CRA audits of Muslim charities. Therein, we outline the ways in which Islamophobic bureaucratic analysis is purveyed as respectable governance practice in tax audits. 2. Included in my written submission is a table of contents of the 2023 book Systemic Islamophobia in Canada, a Research Agenda, featuring 19 essays by me and my colleagues. Each essay examines aspects of how public and private institutions in Canada purvey and enable Islamophobia. 3, I'm currently a member of the Advisory Committee of the Charitable Sector under the Ministry of National Revenue. In that capacity, I chaired a working group examining the implication of Finance Canada's National Inherent Risk Assessment of 2023, or NIRA 2023, on Canada's charitable sector. We found that NIRA 2023 creates the conditions for Islamophobic bureaucratic practice, reasoning, in its selection of what it calls, quote, high-risk jurisdictions, end quote, in its analysis of threat actors, and in its assessment of which threat actors use charities as funding channels. Fundamentally, we raise concerns about the absence of robust Charter Section 15 considerations in our national security landscape. The report currently sits with the Minister of National Revenue. I hope this committee might draw upon that report as you continue deliberations. In the interest of time, I will skip my 4th example on the Proceeds of Crime Act and FinTrack. In conclusion, there is no quick fix for structural Islamophobia. My recommendation to the committee is to outline in your final report that structural Islamophobia in Canada's public and private institutions exists, runs deep, and must be addressed throughout the commitment of substantial and sustained public resources. Thank you very much.
Very much. We'll now go to Dr. Zine, please.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm a Muslim scholar of racism and Islamophobia studies and co-founder and vice president of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, ISRA, which is a global hub for the field of anti-Muslim racism. I'm jet lagged this morning since I got back late last night from ISRA's 3rd International Conference on Islamophobia that was held in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We brought together 70 scholars from around the world to address Islamophobia as a global condition, and we held a special session with genocide scholars to consider the deadly parallels between the Bosnian genocide and the ongoing genocide in Gaza, after which we visited the Genocide Memorial in Srebrenica as a reminder of the deadly consequences of Islamophobia, which is something we know all too well here in Canada, and as we are gathered here today on the June 6th anniversary of the London terror attack. Now, I've been studying Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism in Canada for the past 2 decades. Strikingly, over the past several months, I have felt a profound sense of post-9/11 deja vu, as the massive scale of Israel's deadly violence in Gaza continues to unfold and the legacy of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism as a global project continues. I wrote a book called Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, about how Canadian Muslim communities, especially youth, navigated that fraught context